we've been doing for a year and a half now, and 3 different sessions. And thank God when we finish tonight's class, there will be no more controversies in all of Jewish history. It's all finished, and anything else has missed its chance, and it's over and done. Tonight's class is actually, I don't know what we do on Monday night next week. I'm going to miss you all. There's a board meeting if any of you want to come. Tonight's class, it's actually not really fair to call tonight's class a controversy. It's a fundamentally different type of controversy than all the other controversies we've been discussing. All 3 issues that we're going to address tonight have to do with words and language. And not to downplay that, as we're going to actually spend an entire night talking about it, and it's important the way that we express things and how we express things. But it's not like the controversy of whether or not you should join the Irgun or the Haganah, and whether or not you should attack the British or you should be defensive, where lives were at stake on both sides of the equations, and people felt it was literally pikuach nefesh. The three issues we're going to be discussing tonight all have to do, as I mentioned, with words. You're probably familiar on some level with all 3 of these issues. They're classic issues, but what I'd like to do tonight is really going to address them all together, and in the context of what we've been discussing over what has been a phenomenal century in Jewish history, a miraculous century in Jewish history, and a century the likes of which have never been seen before. And let's just introduce the topics with what we've been discussing. The parable that we've used many times, I'm going to not say the whole thing over again since we've said it many times, but the prince who comes home to the king, and the king had promised him a bride that when he will take over the kingdom, who will be beautiful on the inside and beautiful on the outside, capable and talented. The prince comes home after his father's death, if you remember the parable, and who knocks on the door? This very unseemly, unattractive, totally incapable woman who says, I'm your bride. And the prince has to figure out, how do I relate to this woman? How did she know to say that? But she's clearly not what I've been waiting for. My father promised me very clearly X, and it's not X that's showing up, it's something very different. That was the paradigm that we've sort of been using to try to figure out how, as Jews, do we relate to this phenomenal event in world Jewish history of the return of the Jews to the land of our fathers. It's miraculous, it's amazing. It's what we've been waiting for 2,000 years. And almost every single part of the way that it happened didn't fit what or how we were told to wait for it. And it created quite a number of complexities that we've been discussing. In that context, we're not going to go through all that again. That's what we've been doing for the last number of weeks. Let's address the following 3 issues. Let's talk about Hatikva, let's talk about the Declaration of Independence, and the Tefllah for the states of Israel. Okay, here we go. You can't get more hot button topic than that, right? But it's going to be okay, not to worry. Hatikva, let's start with Hatikva, which means, of course, the hope. Hatikva is the hope. Hatikva was composed in the late 1870s by Naftali Herz Imber, who was a Jewish poet from Zolochiv in Austrian Poland, which is today part of the Ukraine. He wrote it while still in that area of Europe. And in 1882, shortly after composing this poem, he wrote many, many poems. Shortly after composing it, he immigrates to the land of Palestine and shares his poem with many of the various early yeshuvim that were just beginning, as we've been discussing in the past, the late 1800s. The Jews begin to make their way back, and his poem is very popular. It's actually 9 stanzas. We're going to take a look at the actual poem in its entirety very briefly in a moment. But the early colonies, they take to it. It's put to music in 1888, a little while later, by Samuel Cohen, and he bases it partly on an old Romanian song that he knew from his childhood, as well as an Italian 16th century work called, I'm going to mispronounce it, La Mantavona. And for those who claim over the centuries, like, it's not an original piece, it never was claimed to have been an original piece. He was very open that this is the music that he borrowed for it, and the words, together with the music, made it into a very, very popular song. By 1897, it was actually adopted by the first Zionist Congress as its official theme song. The Chovevei Tzion adopted it, and it became, as you're all familiar, very, very popular, even before the founding of the State of Israel. As I was preparing for this class, I came across, I'm sure many of you have heard it as well, the BBC, 5 days after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, sent a reporter to the camp who filmed and recorded what it was that he saw and reported back to England on his finds, and he played, you can find this on YouTube, the survivors of Bergen-Belsen 5 days after their liberation singing Hatikva. And it's quite a moving experience to hear. This is 3 years prior to the founding of the States, but the song had already taken hold, and if you listen carefully to the words you hear, it's not the words that we sing. It's going to be the words that we're going to see in the original poem before they were revised and edited. But to hear them singing in Bergen-Belsen is really is a testimony to how popular it became and why it was the natural choice for the new nascent nation's official song, because it was well known amongst the circles of Jews, particularly the Zionist Jews in the land of Israel at the time. The British Mandate government already banned it in 1919 because of all the Arab pressures. The Jews were using this was their theme song, and due to pressures, it was actually banned to be performed or sung publicly in British Mandate Palestine in 1919 for a state. And as I mentioned, when the state was established, it was unofficially proclaimed as a national anthem. It was unofficial all the way until 2004, when it was officially established by the Knesset. You can look this up, I'm not making this up. When it was officially voted on by the Knesset to become the official song of the state of Israel. But again, in 45 in Bergen-Belsen, that's what everybody's saying. So you can imagine it's what everybody's saying in the early years of the state, and it just never was officially voted and ratified in whatever form it needed to be to actually become the song. It was not so simple, by the way, besides for what we're going to talk about, which is controversy, again, it's the wrong word, but pressure from the right. There's a lot of pressure when the Knesset adopted it from the left, because Israel, as you know, as much as we love and identify it as the Jewish homeland, is home to many, many citizens who are not Jews. It's home to many, many Arabs who are Israeli citizens, as you know. And the Israeli citizens who are Arab look at this national song and say, that doesn't represent me in the state of Israel of which I am a citizen. And there were many members of Knesset, for example, who are Arab, and which is its own discussion into itself, how in the world, it's just a funny thing. But there were many in the land who are citizens of this land who don't agree, adopt it, or sing it because they don't feel it represents them and the state that they're in. So that's besides what we're talking about tonight, which is obviously the more religious response to Hatikva, but there are other issues with it as well. In any case, as I mentioned, it's 9 stanzas long. Only 2 of them were adopted as the official national anthem, which you are familiar with, and they were revised from the original. Rav Kook didn't care for this poem of Hatikva. Rav Kook, who we discussed at length, who had his very redemptive vision of everything that was taking place in the land of Israel. And if you remember, he was an island because the religious community that was already in Israel looked at him and said, excuse me, how can you support all that's going on? What's going on is anti-religious, it's anti-Shabbos, it's anti-kosher, it's anti-God. Why are you supporting this? And he said, because this is the way the redemption is happening. If you remember, the quote that we said from him was, who are we to question the ways of God? This is how he's bringing the redemption, so this is the way that he's bringing the redemption. And he partnered with the early Zionists to try to make it, first we build, then we sanctify. That was his theme. But the people on the left who he was partnering with looked at him and they said, we're not interested in building to sanctify, we're trying to create a new land, a new Jew. And he was an island on his own because he saw something that neither of the 2 camps were interested in. The religious weren't interested in partnering with the Zionists, and the Zionists didn't buy into the vision of Rav Kook as to what they were doing. Don't use us as your pawns for whatever vision you have. We're not interested in that. So he saw this poem, and in his vision, he didn't care for it. He never was against saying it. All the reports say that he was never against saying it because he viewed the Zionists with such great favor as building the land, and this was their theme song, so it had some sanctity to it. As he said, everything had that sanctity to it. But it had in his mind a certain negative or pessimistic attitude, as if the Jews were barely surviving, barely holding on, and all they have left is a little bit of hope. And he didn't find that was the right flavor or tone for what was now becoming a redemptive process. The poem, as we'll see, focused on the Churban, on the destruction, on Jews barely surviving. and he wanted something more than that. So what he did is he penned, if you remember when we discussed him, he was a tremendous linguist, he was a poet, he was a deep, sensitive soul. He wrote his own poem, which he hoped would replace Hatikva as the national anthem, that was focused on faith, not on hope. On emunah, not on tikva. It's a fine nuance between Hatikva, which is hope, and emunah, which is faith. He wanted to focus his poem, as we'll see more, on Torah, on a more overt identity with Hashem, and on the eternal destiny of the Jewish people. If you look it up online and you read up on this, you'll see that there are reports that the Rav Kook students today still sing his poem as their, so to speak, national anthem as part of their events. So I haven't been there long, so I asked Rabbi Neumann, who's the head of the Torah Mitzvah and Kol, who's a student of the Rav Kook Yeshiva. So I saw him this morning. I say, so this poem, Hamedina, is that still? And before I finished the word, he went into his song right away. He said, everybody knows the song. We sing it at every single event, and he sang me the whole thing with great fervor. So it is still true today that you will find the students of the Rav Kook Yeshiva view that poem that he wrote in the way. Let's take a look at the two poems. If you flip to page 3 and 4. Or, was it 4 and 5, excuse me. So let's take a look at the original poem. We'll do it very quickly. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. But we're going to notice a little bit the revisions that were made to the original and the parts that were dropped, because that's also going to be important in the context of our discussion. Our hope, I'm going to read it in English if you want to, just for simplicity's sake, but the Hebrew is of course beautiful on its own. Our hope is not yet lost. The first two paragraphs we should read in Hebrew to see what was originally. Odlo of the tikvasenu, our hope is not yet lost. Hatikva hanoshana, the ancient hope. Mishuv li eretz avotenu, to return to the land of our fathers. Le'irba David chana, to the city where David encamped. And what's different between this and the version that we know? Right, we sing Odlo of the tikvatenu. Hatikva, Bachnot Alpayim. So, not the ancient, but the 2,000-year-old hope. That the original poem was Mishuv le'eretz avotenu, to return to the land of our fathers. And we say, to be a free land. It's the difference between those two. The original poem connects it back to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the land of our fathers. What we have now is just, we want to be free. We want to be our own people. Le'ir ba David chana, to the land that King David encamped in has become Eretz Tzion. Kol od bilvavo shamut pnima, as long as in his heart within Nefesh Yehudi Homiyah, the soul of a Jew still yearns. Ulafate Mizrach Kadim, and onward towards the end of the east, his eye still looks towards Tzion. I'm going to read the rest in English just to get the flavor. As long as tears from our eyes flow like benevolent rain, and throngs of our countrymen still pay homage to the graves of our fathers, as long as there's as long as the right Kol Od is the theme. As long as our precious wall appears before our eyes, and over the destruction of our temple, an eye still wells up with tears. Which is a line obviously focusing on the destruction and mourning the destruction. And as long as we still mourn, he writes, as long as we still cry over the destruction, as long as the waters of the Jordan in fullness swell its banks and down to the Sea of Galilee with tumultuous noise fall, as long as on the barren highways the humbled city gates mark among the ruins of Jerusalem, a daughter of Tzion still cries. Again, as long as there's still that one daughter crying over the destruction, as long as pure tears flow from the eye of the daughter of my nation, and to mourn for Tzion at the watch of night she still rises. Again, another paragraph reflecting, as long as someone is still crying and still mourning and remembering, as long as the feeling of love of nation throbs in the heart of a Jew. Is he talking singular or plural when he talks about the Jews? He needs one Jew. As long as it throbs in the heart of a Jew, then we can still hope even today that a wrathful God may have mercy on us. Hear, O my brothers, in the lands of exile, the voice of one of our visionaries who declares that only with the very last Jew, only there is the end of our hope. So this idea, Rav Kook didn't like this. He didn't like the focus on the tears and the Chorban. We certainly cry in Tisha B'Av, but that the national longing should be one still of tears and of sadness and of mourning and of, we just need one Jew left who still remembers, then our hope is not lost. It didn't move him. So what did he do? Let's take a look on the next page. He wrote a short poem. It's in the boxes, the 4 stanzas. La'ad chaya bil vavenu, eternally there lives in our hearts, plural hearts, ha'emuna ha'ne'emana. No longer talking about hope, but talking about a steadfast, a permanent emuna. Lashuv el eretz kodshenu, irba David chana. To return to the Holy Land, that which David had settled. So what does he put in right away? Lashuv el eretz kodshenu. What's our yearning? What's our emuna? To our holy land. Shama na'amod l'gorolenu. There we shall fulfill our destiny. Av Hamon kana, which the Av Hamon is a reference to Avram acquired. So tying it again into our history and our destiny. Shama nichyeh chayenu. There we will live our life. Chayei adas mimana. Again, borrowing a phrase from Chumash, the life of the nation of multitudes. Shama navod Elokeinu. And what will we do in the land that we will return to? There we will serve our God. He's not mincing words. What's the point of the return? Not just to be an am chafshi, not just to be free, but to be free to do something, to serve Elokeinu, b'chedva, begila uveranana, with joy and with happiness and with song. And what's he contrasting? The tears. No more mourning. We're back. The redemptive process is happening in front of our eyes. Again, he dies in 1935. So he's still early in the process. Again, as we mentioned when we learned on the class, he would have never believed in a million years that 100 years or 80 years after his passing, we would still be living in Montreal. He would never believe it. But he felt, it's happening. No more tears and crying. We're going to serve our God with joy and happiness and song. We're going to head to Yerushalayim on the 3 festivals. Torah's Chayim Chemdoseinu, the Torah of life is our desire. Putting Torah in, which is not part of the original poem. Mipi Elyon Nitna, given by a heavenly mouth, heavenly voice. Netzachi Nachalateno, forever it is our heritage. Midbar Matana, a gift acquired in the desert. So this is the poem that he wrote, penned to become the national anthem in his hope. That it focuses on joy, on redemption, on Torah, on God, on a return to Artseinu HaKadoshah, to our holy land. The poem did not take as a national movement. Again, as I mentioned, it's still sung by the students of Rav Kook. They know it all. But this was his poem. What was changed, what became the national anthem, is of note, back to those first 2 paragraphs, all the 7 final stanzas were dropped. The final stanzas, which talk about mourning and crying and David's place, all of that was dropped. And what became the national anthem was not even to return to the Eretz Avotenu, just to become an Am Chavshi Ba'artzeinu, to become a free nation. So that's just a little bit of the history to start us off in terms of the context of everything we've been discussing. And you can hear, again, when I say controversy, it's a battle of words. But you can hear in the words of the original poem, the revised poem that actually became the national anthem, and the words of Rav Kook, this battle we've been discussing over what's taking place here in the land right now, what should be taking place, and the competing values or ideals that the players at the time had as this is taking place. So far, so good? Interesting historical note. Let's move on to the next.
Just a second.
Yeah.
When did the revised version become the national anthem?
2004 was, I don't know when, the different revisions clearly happened before that. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, let's move on to the Declaration of Independence. So as you know, it was officially declared Friday afternoon, May 14th of 1948, the 5th of Iyar. There were actually 3 major drafts that led to the final version, which was too long. I guess I could have given you the whole thing, but you could look it up easily online if you'd like. The final revision, which is where our story takes place, is at a committee meeting which included David Ben-Gurion, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman Maimon. Fishman, he clearly changed his name at some point, or it was changed. You'll see him referenced sometimes as Rabbi Fishman, sometimes as Rabbi Maimon. Moshe Sharet and Aaron Zisling. They are the major players in the final committee meeting working on the final revisions of the draft of what will become the official Declaration of Independence. Now, the last two major issues that they were debating as they went to press was one issue of borders and the issue of religion. The issue of borders is not relevant to us tonight. There was a debate that raged within the committee meetings if they should accept the UN borders that they had proposed. There was, of course, at that night on midnight, Friday night at midnight, the mandate would officially end, and the Jews were preparing to declare independence and form their state, and the UN, had given them borders. These are where the borders were supposed to be. So there was one group within the party that said, okay, that should be our borders, and we should put that into our declaration of here, this is our country. And Ben-Gurion led the charge to say, no, we shouldn't put that in. What was his argument? He said, we know that moments after declaring independence, what's going to happen? There's going to be a war. With the hope and prayer that we'll be successful, why should we put into our declaration a border that we know our enemies aren't going to accept anyway, and we might actually push beyond during the course of the war? So why limit ourselves to a border that no one is going to recognize anyway from our enemies and our neighbors? So he wanted to not keep it. That was the whole debate. That was a separate historical issue, which is not for us tonight. The other issue was, of course, religion. Major issue in the founding of the State of Israel. What should we do with the nature of religion? So, Rav Maimon, we have to discuss a little bit, a little historical background into this Rav Maimon. A very fascinating figure, lived from 1875 to 1962. Born in Russia, made Aliyah in 1913, and he was ordained by Rabbi Michal Epstein, who was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. And was a tremendous Zionist. He was one of the founders of the Mizrahi movement in 1902 and attended every Zionist convention from 1909 to 1948. During the course of his life, wherever he lived, he was arrested by the local authorities for his Zionist activities. He was arrested by the Russians when he was in Russia. He was arrested by the British when he was in the Mandate. He was arrested by the Ottomans before the Mandate and expelled to the U.S. When he was in the U.S., he established the Mizrahi there. He was involved in the establishment of the chief rabbinate, which appointed, of course, Rav Kook when it was founded. He helped found the Mosada Rav Kook Yeshiva and Foundation in 1937 after Rav Kook's passing, was eventually elected to the Knesset, and was awarded the Israel Prize in 1958. He was one of the signatories on the Declaration of Independence, and it was he who was called upon by Ben-Gurion to recite the Shechrianu immediately following the Declaration of Independence on that Friday afternoon. So his credentials as a Zionist, I think, are pretty clear. He, at this meeting, insisted that in the wording of the Declaration of Independence, that God is mentioned. And he insisted that at the very end, the final paragraph, again, the Declaration is very long, it describes all the kinds of things that a Declaration of Independence should describe, and then the very last paragraph begins, mitoch bitachon, within the placing our trust in, whatever we place our signatures here. So he insisted that we place our trust in God. Even the United States Declaration of Independence has more references to God. So he wanted to say Elokei Yisrael, to the God of the Jewish people, or to Tzur Yisrael v'go alo, which is a phrase that we're all familiar with from what we're going to discuss in a few moments, the Tefllah. Tzur Yisrael v'go alo, the Rock of Israel and its Redeemer. Now that's a clear reference to Tzur Yisrael v'go alo. The Tzur is found many times in Chumash as a reference to Hashem. Hashem is referred to as Tzur. We reference him in the Siddur many times as Tzur Yisrael, right before Shemona Esrei. Tzur Yisrael. He's the Tzur Yisrael. Tzur Yisrael v'go alo is clear. The Rock of Israel and her Redeemer. So he insisted one of those two phrases have to be in there in order for him to sign the Declaration of Independence. Sitting across the table from him was a Jew by the name of Aaron Zisling, who was a secularist left-wing leader of Mapam. Mapam, which of course was the workers' political party, very secular, nothing to do with religion, and he refused to sign the documents if there would be any reference to a God that he didn't believe in as part of that document. Now in my quote, I actually put God with a dash. I'm sure he would not have put a dash in there, but we of course do. He refused to sign. If there's a reference to God in this document, so here you're Ben Gurion, you have to get a document signed, and you have two Jews sitting on the table, one who says, I will not sign if there's not a reference to God in this document, and one who says, I will not sign if there is a reference to God in this document. Now, making the issue more complex, and a great historical little footnote is, this is Friday afternoon. So the mandate officially ended at midnight, which is obviously well into Shabbos. So there was a group of Jews who felt, well, that's when we should declare independence. As soon as the mandate ends, we should declare independence. The religious parties said, Shabbos again, no, Shabbos. Ben Gurion felt, why should we gratuitously offend the religious people? There's no reason for that. Let's do it on Friday afternoon before Shabbos. Kol hakavod to him, that was the decision that he made. Well, that put us into the Erev Shabbos craziness. So they called us for 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday afternoon, and all morning you can't get the two Jews to agree what should the final text read, and he's got to get it in before Shabbos. They already made the announcement, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we're declaring independence, because we got to get it in before sundown. So here you have, if you think your Friday is crazy. So Ben Gurion is trying to negotiate between these two parties, what is he going to do? And he comes up with the following solution, which you are familiar with. He said, how about we'll go with Tzor Yisrael, and we'll drop the Goalo and her Redeemer. So that it only says, the Rock of Israel. And what did he accomplish with that? He said, to the religious people, Tzor Yisrael is a reference to God. To the irreligious people, the Rock of Israel is whatever you want it to be. And that's what he said. I gave you his quotes here in letter number D1. Rock, he says, each of us in his own way believes in the Rock of Israel. Every Jew can believe in the Rock of Israel. Because what does the Rock of Israel mean? To some, however he conceives it. Let me go right. To some, it's the supernatural creator. To some, it just means the Jewish people's traditions. It's a rock, it's always been there. To some, it's our fortitude and unbreakable connection to the land. To some, it's nature. And to some, it's the army. Placing our trust, and therefore the final paragraph of the Declaration of Israeli Independence reads, placing our trust in the Rock of Israel. Mitoch bitachon b'tzor Yisrael. And Ben Gurion then said in his quotes, I make one request, please don't make me put this to a vote. And they did not vote on it. That line was negotiated by Ben Gurion between the two factors, and he came up with a solution, and without a vote, that was the last piece of the document. They rushed it to Independence Hall and made a declaration. I'm sure you've been familiar with the history about the guy who was carrying it, got stuck without a ride, and he had to get in a cab. It was a whole story. He literally walked in at 3:59. At 4 o'clock, he gives it to Ben Gurion to read. A whole to-do. If you haven't been to Independence Hall, I'm sure you all have been there. It's a must-go in Tel Aviv. It's an awesome experience just being there. And they hear the recordings, and you're sitting in the room. It's really, it's something. Okay, now a historical footnote, fascinating historical footnote. The government had to translate their official declaration, because that's your government, your new government right now, so you can write in Hebrew, but they gave it out to all these other, England and America. In the official English translation, the last paragraph was rendered, placing our trust in God Almighty. Oh, wow. And it was not changed until 1962. Like one of those just fascinating historical blips that either nobody noticed, nobody cared, nobody changed it. But even though it went through all this background to get to Tzor Yisrael, in the English rendition, the official government rendition actually said placing our trust in God Almighty, until it was changed in 1962 back to its literal Rock of Israel. Now again, in our context, it's really hard to underestimate the significance of this little piece of history. We have here a return of the Jewish people after 2,000 years of yearning, 2,000 years of exile, 2,000 years of crusades, inquisitions, pogroms, Chmielnicki's uprising, the Holocaust. 2,000 years, and the Jews come home. 2,000 years of Pesach Seders, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. 2,000 years of every single wedding, every single place in the world with ash on the head of the groom and a broken glass, and Imesh Gachech Yerushalayim, and the Jews come home, and who was not invited to come home with them? It's hard to underestimate the religious significance of the fact that the U.S. Declaration of Independence, Canada's Declaration of Lower Canada's Declaration, I looked it up, they all have references to God in it. And the Israel, Jewish return to the homeland had to sneak in the back door with Tzor Yisrael that can reference whatever you want. The army, Iraq, nature, baby God. It's significant. It speaks to what we've been talking about over the complexity of the story of the prince coming home and saying, this is the redemption that I've been yearning for 2,000 years? That my own God couldn't find his way in to the recreation of our state? And it's complex because, as we've been talking about, who were the Jews that actually got this done? It was a secular Zionist group that didn't want God in there. They wanted a separation of church and state. They wanted to be a nation like every other nation. So separation of church and state works really well in America. It works really well in other lands. But what do we do in Israel? And so it today continues to perplex the Jewish people of how do we set up this country, which is our Jewish homeland, as religious Jews wanting a religious country. 90% of the country is not religious. How does this work? This is the most fascinating, complex study in religion probably ever, of the creation of this miraculous return to our homeland that is not at all the way that anybody would have imagined or dreamed of, and every step of the way is complex. And I think the reflection of this little story, the Declaration of Independence, again, just reflects that. As far as I happen to know a very, very significant Talmud Chacham who could not, he's passed away 15 years ago already at this point, who could not support the modern state of Israel because he lived through this era, he could not get past this. He could not get past what he viewed to be the biggest Chilul Hashem of the 20th century, that God couldn't be put in this Egypt. He couldn't get past it. I'm not judging. I'm just stating I think most of us don't even really think about it. We take it for granted. The state is the state. It's a miraculous place. It's amazing. It's our home. We visit. We support. We love. It's beautiful. And it's complex in certain areas. But that is that's the part of that. Let's go to our final point, and then we'll tie this all together. And that's the tefillah for the state of Israel. Okay. Now, we all know and love the tefillah as we say it every week. I gave you just the first paragraph on your final page, on the back of page 5. Just the final paragraph. I couldn't find a version that didn't have Hashem's name all over the place, and I didn't want to create all of the shemos on the photocopy, so I just gave you the first 2 paragraphs. A little bit of background. It's a long-standing tradition for Jews to pay for the welfare of the government in which they live. That is nothing new. It goes all the way back to Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah teaches the Olam, a person should always pray for the peace of his country, because if there's no government, the Mishnah is a very strong language. Ishes re'eu chayim b'la'o. Man will swallow his fellow man whole, like Lord of the Flies. If there's no government, if there's no control, it's anarchy. And therefore the sages taught always, always, always pray for peace. And historically speaking, we have records, the original prayer that we say every week, the version of Anosein Shua Lamlachim, who gives grand salvation to kings, was originally composed in Spain for King Ferdinand. And what did he do in Jewish history? But you know what? The Jews prayed that his government should be safe. We have records in communist Russia, Jews praying for Stalin, and even in Germany up to 1933, the Jews prayed for the welfare of the government of Germany. That's what we do. As long as the government is maintaining order and control, the Jews have always prayed for. So the idea of davening, praying for your local government is not a new thing. Nothing to do with the modern state of Israel, whether you think you should. It's nothing to do with that. We always pray for our governments, no matter who that government is, as long as it's better for the Jews that there should be a government than not. There have been fascinating debates throughout Jewish history when the governments do things that are very detrimental to the Jews. Do we revise? Do we not revise? There have been some fascinating articles, if you're interested, when Obama, former President Obama, signed the Iran deal, So there was, as you know, I'm sure you talk politics here a little bit. Are you happy? So there was a firestorm of activity about how he did it. It was crazy. So there were a lot of articles, you could look them up, about what type of tefillah should be said in the States, for the government that was turning its back, and everybody was afraid it was going to lead to the destruction of Israel. And led in those articles, in the back and forth, there was a lot of scholars did a lot of research and found historically all sorts of emendations and revisions throughout the centuries of what Jews did in different points of our exile to handle different governments. Fascinating. In the late 1800s in the U.S., for example, they had different prayers for when Congress was in session and when Congress wasn't in session. And they changed it from praying for the person to praying for the government, because in Europe they always prayed for the person. There was a king. And in the States, there no longer was a king. There became this idea of the elected officials. And so that's when they traced the first time the Siddur changed the language from a king to a government, all sorts of fascinating things. But in any case, the idea of praying for the government is an old thing. So when the state was founded, so we needed a prayer for our own government. So Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog, the first chief rabbi, first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, so he composed the Tefillah. Historically, there's a lot of historical background. Very, very briefly, there was a long time where scholars thought that Shai Agnon wrote the Tefillah. It's clear now that he did not. What happened was that Reb Herzog wrote it, and he wrote. There was no printing press. There was a printing press. There wasn't a computer where you cut and paste. He gave 2 handwritten copies. One to Reb Uziel, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi, for approval. He wanted it to be approved from both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic chief rabbi. And then he gave a copy to Shai Agnon, not to approve, but to improve. He wanted it to make it a little bit more literary, be more appealing from a literary perspective. Shai Agnon, who didn't have the computer technology just to take it, scan it, and cut and paste, so he had to rewrite it with his revisions. So he basically took the text that Reb Herzog wrote, made a few changes, and gave it back. Scholars then found that copy that Shai Agnon had written, and for many, many years thought that Shai Agnon was the author of this tefillah. It's very, very clear now, historically speaking, that that's not the case. He edited it, but Reb Herzog wrote the tefillah. The controversy surrounds 3 words. The entire tefillah is beautiful. It's based on psukim. It's based on the yearnings of every Jew to return home. There's not much to say, even though, of course, there are those who will get that in a second. But the only issue really is about 3 words in the tefillah. What are the 3 words? Reshit Smichat Ge'ulateinu. So I gave you the text. You have it in front of you. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It's in the Siddur in front of you as well. If you want to open up your Siddur. Avinu Shebashamayim, Sor Yisrael V'Golo. So we put that text, he put that right in. Sor Yisrael V'Golo, the Rock of Israel and her Redeemer. Varechas Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Smichat Ge'ulateinu. Which means the first flowering of our redemption. Now, even before we get to that, so why is this such a big issue? These 3 words, right? 3 words. You do say, you don't say. Why is it a big issue? So, do we have a right to declare this? What does it mean to say and to declare Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulateinu? That means to say, this is the first flowering of the redemption. Now, every Jew has the right to believe that. We can believe it is, we can believe it's not. It's very nice to believe whatever we want to believe. Do we have a right to legislate as a statement of fact that the redemption has in fact begun? Do we know that? Has any prophet told us? It looks that way, it smells that way. Now again, let me go back a little bit in time. To us now, 70 years later, we could say with a lot of confidence, it looks that way, it smells that way, it appears based on everything that we know, this is where we're going. In 1948, less so. It was miraculous and joyous, but again, remember, there were 2 major parties which we've discussed. You had the Mizrahi, you had the Aguda, you have those who say, this is inappropriate what we're doing right now, this isn't the way it's supposed to happen. And those who said, it's great, this is the best thing that's ever happened since the destruction of the temple, and all the things we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks. But to now legislate, do we say, this is indeed, because we know it to be true, this is indeed the first flowering of the redemption. So our discussion, our last remaining moments tonight will be on this phrase and the reasons for and against. Now, everything else, as I mentioned, is basically just pretty universal. Although I want to mention, I'm not interested in talking about that. There are those, this is not our discussion, but there are those who don't want to say the tefillah at all, as I'm sure you're familiar with such places. They don't say it at all. Not for what we're talking about tonight. That issue, I want to just, let me just distinguish the two issues. You have the issue of those who say, again, as we've been discussing many times, that the entire founding of the state is wrong. It's not supposed to have happened this way. It wasn't done in the correct manner. It's not what we're supposed to be doing, and we're not supposed to support it. And those who feel that way and feel that the modern state is not a reflection of Jewish values or whatever it may be, so they don't want to say the tefillah at all. Now, if they live in Israel, everybody always said the prayer for their government. So that's one issue. But if you don't live in Israel, so they don't want to, so there's such groups. I'm not even talking about those groups. I'm talking about within those who want to support and be Zionistic and say, this is amazing and miraculous and I fully support it. Within that is the discussion of these three words. The other discussion is on the entire tefillah, and that's, I think we've covered that in the last couple of weeks, why they don't want to say that. We're not talking about within a camp that says, fully Zionistic, support it, this is amazing, should we or should we not say those words? Okay, what are the reasons? What are the reasons not to? What are the reasons not to? Now, the reasons not to are going to combine some of the reasons that that other group that doesn't want to say the tefillah at all will come up. But let's put all those reasons together. And again, we'll do this quickly because most of these we've touched upon over the last couple of weeks. Number one, it violates the famous 3 oaths. We've been discussing, the Gemara says that the Jewish people took a number of oaths when they went into exile. One of the oaths was not to rebel against the nations in which they are hosted by. And another one of the oaths was not to storm the land of Israel, kichoma, like a wall. Many interpretations. What does it mean, like a wall? Basic understanding is by force, in great mass, we, so to speak, took an oath, the Gemara says, not to approach the land of Israel as this great wall. And the way that it was done, many felt violated that oath and was therefore inappropriate because we came by force. Witnessed the discussion we had 2 weeks ago about Lehi and about the Irgun, and it was a rebellion against the powers that were, the British, and the whole thing was therefore inappropriate. Others wanted to claim, you know how we know that this is wrong? It's not really the redemption because the order of how the redemption is happening is wrong. Because the order is, as we have many sources throughout Tanakh, the prophets always said, first what has to happen? Shuva Yisrael. Repent. And what's going to happen after you repent? I'll bring you home. So since all the prophets seem to speak with one voice of Shuva Yisrael, repent and then I'll take you home, well, what's happening in front of us? It's the other way around. It's first we're going home and then we're supposed to repent. We don't have a model for that. That doesn't say that anywhere. So this doesn't seem like it's this can't be redemption. And we have the Rambam who paskins that the order is going to be as follows. First, the rulers of the Jewish people who descend from King David will take power. Then the Rambam writes they'll rebuild the Holy Temple. And then Mashiach will gather all the dispersed Jews from the diaspora. Well, King David, Temple, ingathering of the exiles by by Mashiach, this is all out of order. Not only that, we have several sources which seem to imply that it's going to be miraculous. Now, many of us, myself included, would look at what's gone on in the last 7 years and say, there's no bigger miraculous event in the last 7 years of Jewish history. But it's not the kind of miracle of like temples falling from heaven kind of miracle. It's not splitting of the sea, it's just 6-day war kind of miracles. And deserts blooming and becoming national powers in 70 years. Like, those kinds of miracles. But not the kinds of miracles that one would have expected in like a biblical walking on water, splitting sea kind of war. Number 5, we have the leaders are not observant. This is the argument that we've said over many times. And the state is not built on halacha nor Jewish principles. So that, and this is a very important argument, democracy is nice. All of us who've grown up in democratic countries, I think would say it's beautiful, and I think as Winston Churchill is the one I think said it's not perfect, but it's the best option we have. But does that make it Jewish? Is there any idea in the Torah at all about democracy being the way to rule a country?
Majority. You go by majority.
We go by majority when we have to paskin a shiloh or judge a case. But is the idea of leadership by democracy Jewish, or is kings and aristocracy Jewish? So we have kings. So we have this country which is founded on the ideals of democracy, and it's one of the amazing things that's often said, you've all heard this 1,000 times, it's the greatest ally of the West in the Middle East. It's the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's a statement of pride for us as Jews and the state of Israel. But does that make it intrinsically being run on Jewish ideals or Torah ideals? So the country's obviously not. It gets complex. There are a lot of things that are, that aren't. It's complex. So those who say, how can we call this redemption? It doesn't really fit with what we would have thought the Jewish ideals would be. And so those are all the claims that are made. I think the most important of all of them is the last one. This is, again, just my opinion, which is, on this camp, for the reasons not to say it to me, the most important one on that argument is, the bottom line is, even the great sage Rabbi Akiva got it wrong. In the Bar Kokhba revolts, he believed Bar Kokhba was Mashiach, and the redemption had happened and was coming, and he was wrong. And he was wrong by a long time. And if in some of the earlier controversies, remember we discussed after the expulsion from Spain and from Portugal, the Jews settled in the land of Tzfat, and that was the center of all of Torah Judaism in the land of Israel at that time. And they felt at that point, this is it. We've returned to the land, we own land, there was a Jewish governor for the first time since the destruction of the temple, and they also felt the redemption was here. So, I mentioned Rav Kook a few moments ago. Rav Kook felt it was here, right? It's 2017, we're almost 2018. It's 70, 80 years since he died, and he said, this is it. So who knows how long, how this is going to go. So to state that we know something, we just don't know. And all of these combined would be the arguments to say, we can hope that it's the Reshit Tzmichat Gula Seinu, we could want it to be, but to say that it is, all of those would be the arguments on the side of saying, we just don't know. We just don't know. Okay, what about all the reasons to say, which of course, as you all know, we do. Here in Shul, I lost my place. Okay. Okay, so there are quite a number of reasons to say, we should say this. So number one, the Gemara says, I will do this very, very quickly, there are 6,000 years of Jewish history. The Gemara breaks it down into 2,000 years of what they call Tohu, before Torah, 2,000 years of what the Gemara calls the period of Torah, and then 2,000 years of the Yemot HaMashiach, the days of Mashiach. And there's much talk how to break these down and when they each begin. Most of the more contemporary sages have identified the year 1840 as the starting point of the final 2,000 years. And as the Abarbanel and others write, what that means is that the 2,000 years, those final 2,000 years are all when it's possible for him to come. He could not have come before that, but any time during the end of that, he can. And we're at the very end of that period. We call the year 5778. We're like right at the very end. There have been a number of years in Jewish history that have been lost, so to speak. We're not sure if it's exactly 5778. That's a whole other historical discussion about the timing. But we're the last 200, 250, give or take, years. So we're clearly in the right time where it could be.
But what about King Chizkiyahu, who was in the middle 2,000 years?
The Gemara says what could have been the Mashiach, but he didn't sing Shira.
Hashem wanted him to be Mashiach?
Right, he didn't sing Shira. So we could. It's a fair question, but I'm going to leave that aside for tonight. A fair question. We have a number of negative signs the Gemara refers to, things that will take place that will show us that we're in the era of Mashiach. The most prominent of all of those is a statement that the Gemara makes in Masechah Sanhedrin that one of the Amoraim says, I hope that I will not be around to see Mashiach. He says, why not? Because the Chevle Mashiach, the birth pangs leading into Mashiach, it's often referred to, Chazal always like to use an analogy. So birth is a perfect analogy because the end product is glorious. The end product is life, is a new baby. So again, I never went through this myself, but I'm told that the process leading up to that magnificent moment is less magnificent, is difficult, is painful. It's known as the Chevle HaMashiach. And so the sages used that paradigm to describe redemption. That the final product will be amazing. The baby might come out crying, and the mother will be crying the whole way through, but then when everything is all cleaned up, So the sages said, that process is going to be so horrific for the baby and for the mommy, I hope I'm not there to see it. The Chavetz Chaim The great Chafetz Chaim died in 1933, living through World War I. And he said, this is so bad, we are now in the period of the Tefllah HaMashiach. 1933, my friends, he died, and said we were already in the Tefllah HaMashiach. I think I'd be able to say that's the early labor pains. Because what was coming 10, 12 years later put that to shame as far as the pains of the Jewish people. So to say that when I'm sure the sages would read that Gemara for 2,000 years and would come across a statement of someone who said, I hope I'm not there because it's going to be so bad, and would scratch their heads and say, hard to imagine, not hard for any of us to imagine a period of time where a Jew could say, I hope that I would never have been around to have lived through that. And we're now we're building on the ashes of that. But to say that we're now in a period that it's fits for Mashiach to come, for the redemption to start, like you start checking off the boxes of what the sages described it might be like, and we're there. Well, what about some of the positive signs? Number one, the ingathering of the exiles. What we are witnessing is untold in Jewish history. I've mentioned many times that when I was in Atlanta, so I was in the Bible Belt, so there would be a lot of private schools and non-Jewish schools that would take their students to various houses of worship in their course of study, and somehow I ended up on their Orthodox Jewish stuff. And so they would come 3 to 4 times a year. I would meet with different schools and have question and answer sessions. And I would always make the point of the course of some of the question and answer, always, to make the following point to the group of students that I was with. And I would say to them, I want you all to know that you are witnessing the greatest miracle that the world has ever seen. So you know what it is? And they would come up with all sorts of funny answers. They were never anything close to what I wanted. And I would describe that the Jews are coming home. And I would say that you're all students, you're young, you think it's normal that there's a state of Israel, you think it's normal that the world hates the state of Israel, and you think it's normal that all this stuff is going on. But I want you to know how old, and I would say to them, how old is the state of Israel? I would say, do you think it's 5 years, 50, 500, or 5,000? I mean, they have no clue. I'm telling you, I'm telling students, 6th grade, non-Jewish, private school students, no clue to answer 550, 500, 5,000. They have no idea. And to describe to them that we've been in exile for 2,000 years and are coming home, and that half of the world Jewish population is back, and that there were only 100,000 Jews there in the early 1900s, and there were 40,000 in 1850s, 100,000, and then 600,000 in 1948, and 6 million in 2000, and we're almost over the edge of the half of the population, and another 20, 30 years, even if nothing cataclysmic happens in the world, we're going to be at 3/4 of the world Jewish population. Nothing like this has ever happened in world history. Unefutzasenu kanes me'arba kanfos ha'aretz. We daven to gather us from the 4 corners of the world. And you watch from Ethiopia, and you watch from France, and you watch what they did from Russia. India. Oh, India. From all 4 corners of the world, there is nothing that the world has seen like this. So you could say, like, well, who knows if it's really the redemption or not? Yeah, maybe, who knows? But, like, look! Yeah, exactly. Look at what is taking place as far as that. The Navi Yecheskel writes, a beautiful, I didn't quote the exact poetic language, that when the redemption happens, the mountains will sprout, the greenery will return. And when you read the descriptions, Mark Twain and others who were in Israel in the 1800s, what do they describe? A barren desert wasteland. Why would anybody want this land anyway? Mark Twain wrote, it's a wasteland. And where the Jews come, the desert sprouts. It wasn't like that in the 1600s. It was always harsh, dry, rocky. And it literally, when you fly in, I always love when you fly in during the daytime into Eretz Yisrael, and it's just green, and you drive through it. It's magnificent. It's gorgeous. We'll talk, Mir Tashem, another time. I'll have a shir on the stages of redemption, the stages described, and how it follows the Shemona Esrei, and part of it is the Barech Aleinu, the land coming back to life, and we're literally seeing the land come back to life. I told you before when Baron Rothschild opened up the first winery in Eretz Yisrael. So they grew their grapes and they produced the first bottle of wine, and he sent the first bottle of wine to the Netziv, Natalie Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was Rosh Hashiva in Volozhin in Russia. And when the bottle arrived, the Netziv went to put on his Shabbos clothing to greet the first bottle of Jewish wine produced in the land of Israel since the destruction of the temple. What an event. You put on the Shabbos clothing to greet the bottle of wine. And now it's like, yeah, you find the fact that the Israeli wineries are world renowned. The country is 70 years old. It was a swampland with malaria 50, 60, 70 years ago. It is miraculous how the land has sprouted and given forth its fruits, exactly as was predicted. The Ramban who died in the 1200s, writes on the pasuk of Uvaha'art Shomim, forget the exact language of the pasuk, in the Torah, when the Torah gives us the curses that the land will be desolate, and the Ramban comments, it's going to be desolate for every people that will ever dwell here, except for you. The 1200s is what he writes, and we're seeing that literally in front of us. Many have pointed to the Balfour Declaration, the UN Resolution of 47, as addressing the three oaths. That we were not allowed to rebel against the nations. We didn't rebel against the nations. The nations gave us permission. England, which was in charge of the land at the time, from England emanated the Balfour Declaration. The world body, the League of Nations, ratified it in 22, and in 47 voted on it. There's no rebellion. Even if we want to take the oaths as binding, which the halakhic works did not, it's not quoted in any halakhic work, it's not quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not quoted in the Rambam. But even if we were, but we're not violating anything. The nations of the world granted us permission to do so in 1922 already. Rabbi Simcha Dvinska, or Sameach, already saw in the 22 ratification of the League of Nations, he already attributed halachic significance. That the League of Nations ratified the Balfour Declaration, we're free, and we are good to know. The Yerushalmi describes, based on a pasuk in Tehillim, of Ayelet HaShachar, like the rising of the sun, that the redemption will take place again, using the parables, the various parables. It's a sunrise. The sun doesn't show up magically in the middle of the sky. First, over the horizon, it gets a little bit light, and then you see the first rays of light, and then you see the top of the sun. There's a process of sunrise, and the redemption is just like in labor. It's going to be a process. It's going to be a process of the concept of redemption, and many of the sources, as far as in response to the Rambam, many other sources say we really have no idea how this is going to go. We just don't know. The Rambam himself, after he lists what he says is going to happen, himself, he writes, the truth is, he concludes the chapter by saying, even the prophets didn't really have a clear vision of what this is going to look like, so we really don't have any clue. And so, okay, it's happening the way that it's happening. It's not the way that we would have envisioned it. It's not the way that anyone would have drawn it up. But that's the way that it's happening. And in a quote from the Netziv, again, who I quoted, who took out a Shabbos clothes for his bottle of wine, when he was questioned on what was taking place. Again, this is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So he was reportedly quoted to have said, so you want to teach Hashem how we should bring the Geula? You think you know better? You know, this is what's happening, like Rav Kook said. Okay, I wouldn't have thought it's going to happen this way. But this is what it is. Okay, this is what it is. We build, and then we consecrate. We build, and then we sanctify. And so this is exactly what's happening. The reality is when the Jews returned back, after the destruction of the first temple, to rebuild the second temple, it's well quoted, it's already in the Navi itself described that only 44,000 Jews returned. The majority of the Jewish people remained in Babel. They didn't want to leave. They stayed in Babylonia. And of the Jews who came back, the Navi describes the Nebuchs, those who were intermarried, those who didn't keep Shabbos, those who were of questionable lineage, because the aristocracy stayed in Babylonia. They were wealthy, they were rooted, they didn't want to go to this barren land of Israel that was destroyed. So who went? The people who couldn't make it in Babylonia, they went. So to say that only the righteous, that wasn't the way that it happened back in the rebuilding of the second temple. And so who are we to say what's going to happen? Lastly, I just have to share with you, the Kol HaTorah was a sefer that was written by a student of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was brilliant. We've quoted him a number of times as well. One of the students wrote a book called the Kol HaTorah, which refers to the voice of the dove that's going to herald redemption. And he wrote it about what's going to happen. Now the Vilna Gaon again was in the 1700s. And he writes, one of the signs that the redemption is coming, he writes, is when all the religious Jews don't believe that it's happening. That's what he writes. that when the religious Jews say, no, this isn't it, that's one of the signs, the 1700s he wrote, then you know this might actually, it's literally going to be...
It's a smiley guy.
What's that?
It's a smiley guy.
It follows a pattern. It follows a pattern that when you look through the Chumash, there are a number of questionable incidents that take place that I would say we're uncomfortable teaching to children. For example, Lot. Lot fathers 2 children with his daughters. Quite inappropriate. And from that descends the lineage of who's going to become King David through the two. Both of those women are going to marry into the Davidic dynasty. Ruth, who becomes the mother of the Davidic dynasty, and then Shlomo, David's son, marries a woman from Ammon, from the other daughter's lineage. And where does the lineage of King David himself start from? From Yehuda, the tribe of Yehuda, and his 2 children. And who does he father children with? His daughter-in-law. Both of those instances are completely inappropriate. David and Bathsheba, there are numerous other instances of David himself in which one would say questionable. And there's a pattern that the birth of Mashiach and of redemption comes into the world in a way that you wouldn't have thought. Not in the way of this exalted, holy aspect. It's through the back door, through something that we'd have thought was unseemly, something that was inappropriate. It's almost like the story of the Jewish people, always beaten down and downtrodden and always teaching the world something. There's something about that the way redemption, Mashiach, is brought into the world comes about through what we, in our eyes, would say questionable, inappropriate, just unseemly. But that's the way that it's been. Why? A long discussion of which I'm not really equipped to say anything about. But it is. It is. So to say that it's impossible that this can be the redemption because it's not the way we would have thought, well, neither was Lot and his 2 daughters, neither was Yehuda and Tamar, neither is David and his wife Bathsheba. There are lots of patterns like that.
And Solomon with the 1,000.
Which one?
King Solomon and all his wives.
So there are lots of stages along that way. So to say it can't be the last point of what I mentioned of but we just don't know. So how do we make a declaration of a statement of fact? So that's the last one. So to make the arguments again that it can't be because of this and it can't be because of that, it can be because of this and it can be because of that. To say, but how do you know? How do you know for sure that you could say the words Reishit Smichat Gulut? How do you know? So we don't know. We don't know. It's again 70 years later. We can look and we can see and we can say, really looks like it. Every litmus test that we have, every indicator says we're on a path. Do we know for sure? We'll never know for sure until the very end.
Is Mashiach coming before or after the 3rd
I can say
temple?
for sure, we don't know.
know.
That's all there's a tremendous amount of discrepancy whether or not is that going to bring the 3rd temple after the temple. We don't know how the redemption is going to look and how it's going to be. We really don't. Look at what's happening right now. I mean, it seems we're building a nation, we're building a land, there's a birth that's taking place, it's a process, it's a sunrise, it's a process. You look out at what's happening and it's hard to see anything but. It's hard to see anything but. The Jewish people have returned to our homeland after 2,000 years. Torah is stronger in Israel now than since the destruction of the temple. There's been no period in Jewish history since the destruction of the temple till now where the center of Torah is as firmly rooted in the land of Israel. We're building up an economy. It is unbelievable what's taking place. It's miraculous on every level. So do we know for sure? Nobody knows for sure. We just don't. But does every indication say, sell your house in Montreal while you can? For sure. There is one last point, then we'll just tie this all together. There are those who therefore say, not to say, it looks like it is, but to say, I don't really know. There's another group that adds a single 4th word to the phrase. And they say, Shetehei Reishit Tzmichat Gulatenu, which means, may it be the first flowering of our redemption, which is a statement that says, I don't know for sure. Well, what do I know? It looks like it smells like it tastes like it, every indication is it's it, but we're just human beings living through history, we're trying to figure it all out. So there's another group that says that's what you should do. So you have the groups that don't want to say the tefillah at all. Then you have the groups that say it and they drop the phrase. Then you have the groups that say it and they add shitahei, and you have the groups like our shul that says it exactly as it was composed by Rav and ratified by Rav Herzog 70 years ago, as is Reishit Tzmichat Gulatenu in the miraculous time of 1948. You can't imagine Rav Herzog coming up with anything else other than saying that living through what he lived through the war, through the founding of the state. This is the beginning of the flying of the nation. That's certainly our custom to say. But if you come across the various, and is there anything more appropriate for the Jewish people other than to have 6 different minhagim as to how to say? Of course, this is the story of the Jewish people. The one last great miracle that we will witness in the redemption is going to be actually unifying all of us into one. That will really be that. The question is, do we need to do that on our own to bring Mashiach, or is that going to be the final miracle of Mashiach? That I don't know, but it's certainly worth trying. It's certainly worth us trying to do so. Now in any case, let's just tie up with our final one. So we've been discussing this last series of 5 weeks of the modern state of Israel, as I think has become exceptionally clear. It is complex from a religious perspective, looking at what's taking place. It is miraculous, it is amazing. It is the Jewish return to our homeland of 2,000 years, and it has not been without complications, which of course we wouldn't expect anything less. And every day gets closer and closer to the light at the end of the tunnel of the Jews returning home, of establishing ourselves, and God willing, one day, speedily in our days, really seeing it in all of its glory, the actual redemption, which is not just the beginning of the flowering, but the return of the divine presence of Hashem and the Jewish people living together in the Holy Land in a tangible way, which has really been the yearning of the Jewish people, and we're taking all the steps to create the home. Again, as I conclude with the words of Rav Kook, which I've said many, many times tonight and before, first we build, and then we sanctify. The Holy of Holies, the temple itself, had to be constructed, and then once it was constructed, it was sanctified. And we're literally watching a nation, a land, a people being resurrected from exile, from the Holocaust, and to see what we as a people, I take obviously no credit for it, but to see what we have done over the last 70, 80, 90 years is miraculous, mind-boggling, and indeed, it is our fervent hope, the Reishit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the flowering of the redemption, and all of its process, and speedily in our days we should see it brought to its fruition and its completion, and we should all join our brethren in the land of Israel, the establishment of the third Beis HaMikdash, Mashiach Tzidkeinu B'Himenu. It's been a pleasure spending this time together, and we'll have to start a new series, God willing, after the winter break, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure being able to teach some of these classes, and we'll daven Marv and have yourselves a wonderful evening.